The UN system and global governance, global economy, trade and energy organizations, Indo-Pacific and Asian security groupings, major global coalitions and strategic forums, specialized institutions and international law, transnational connectivity and transport corridors, India's bilateral trade pacts and agreements, geopolitics, territorial disputes and border operations.
Welcome to this explainer. Right now, the United Nations is creeping up on a massive, historic milestone, and behind closed doors, a highly complex web of global governance is actively shifting. Today, we're going to break down exactly how member states are rewriting the future of global policy, international security, and literally human survival. Let's get right into it.
When you see these huge rooms with representatives gathered around a table, I know it can kind of just look like a giant photo op. But make no mistake, this is where the real hard decisions happen. Decisions that actually affect your local economy, your digital privacy, and global peace. And honestly, as the world's geopolitical landscape shifts, the institutions governing these discussions, well, they have to evolve too.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Milestones in global governance. 2. Championing human rights. 3. Protecting the vulnerable. 4. Global security and sanctions. And 5. The future of data. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1, Milestones in Global Governance, a look at ECOSOC and the UN 80 Initiative. This timeline plots a pretty fascinating journey. The Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, was established as a principal organ way back in 1945. So we're talking about an 80-year-old institution here. And to keep an 80-year-old giant moving smoothly in today's fast-paced world, Secretary General Antonio Guterres has just launched a major new roadmap for March 2025. The UN 80 Action Plan. Now, this UN 80 initiative isn't just slapping a fresh coat of paint on things. It's an absolute overhaul of the entire system. From the top-level secretariat all the way down to specialized funds, the main goal is to slash through red tape. They want to make the UN agile enough to handle modern crises effectively and to do it on a really tight budget. Ultimately, it's all about improving how mandates are created and actually delivered on the ground. So let's talk numbers for a second. 54. That is the exact number of member states in ECOSOC, all elected by the General Assembly for 3-year terms. You can think of them as the engine room for sustainable development. They're tasked with weaving together the economic, social, and environmental pieces of global policies. It is a huge job. And here's why this is especially relevant right now. India has just been elected to this 54-member body for the 2026 to 2028 term. This is a big deal because it positions them directly at the table, contributing to consensus building and shaping policy dialogue at the very highest levels of the UN system. Moving right along to Section 2, Championing Human Rights, and specifically India's role in the UNHRC.
Speaking of India's growing influence, they were actually elected unopposed to the UN Human Rights Council for a 7th time. They're joining 13 other newly elected countries for a 3-year term that kicks off in 2026. This puts them on the main 47-member Geneva-based body that is fundamentally responsible for promoting and protecting human rights across the globe.
This comparison perfectly illustrates a vital evolution within the UN. Back in 2006, the modern council officially replaced the older commission. Why the change? Well, they needed to add some teeth to the organization. They created a system that's much better equipped for emergency sessions, and crucially, they introduced the Universal Periodic Review. This is a real game changer because it means every single UN member state now gets its human rights record systematically scrutinized. No exceptions.
All right, on to Section 3, Protecting the Vulnerable, focusing on UN Women and UNHCR.
As UN Women gears up for its 15th anniversary in 2025, their immense workload basically boils down to 3 core actions. They advocate for international commitments, they force coordination across all the different UN agencies, and they provide crucial on-the-ground technical support to help governments eliminate discrimination and empower women globally. It's a massive, absolute must-have mandate. To really grasp the sheer scale of the humanitarian front, just look at the number 128. That is the number of countries where the UN Refugee Agency, or UNHCR, currently operates. They're out there protecting the world's most vulnerable populations. We're talking refugees, stateless individuals, and anyone forced to flee their homes due to conflict.
And incredibly, this massive organization is funded almost entirely by voluntary contributions. Oh, and they've won 2 Nobel Peace Prizes along the way. Looking to the future, Barham Salih is set to succeed Filippo Grandi as High Commissioner, stepping into a 5-year term starting in January 2026 to lead these monumental global protection efforts.
Let's transition over to Section 4, Global Security and Sanctions, taking a close look at the 1267 Committee.
Let's demystify this a bit. The 1267 Committee was established way back in 1999, initially to target al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Today, it stands as the UN's single most powerful tool for enforcing multilateral counterterrorism sanctions. Now, this is starkly different from unilateral coercive measures, or UCMs. UCMs are sanctions imposed independently by individual countries, and the UN General Assembly actually adopts resolutions against them pretty frequently. The 1267 Committee, on the other hand, relies entirely on global consensus.
The real-world application here is absolutely critical. For example, the recent inclusion of the Resistance Front, or TRF, in the 1267 report directly intersects with India's ongoing security efforts against cross-border terrorism. It shows exactly how these high-level UN designations translate into tangible, on-the-ground impacts for national security.
Finally, let's dive into Section 5, the future of data with the UNCBD.
As our world rapidly digitizes, data is power, plain and simple. The UN realized they desperately needed a solid framework for modern information, which led to the creation of the UNCEBD in 2014. With Australia stepping up as its very first chair, this body handles the global official statistics that ultimately dictate how international funding and resources are distributed. It's incredibly important work behind the scenes. If you look at the composition of this collaborative network, it's pretty impressive. We've got 31 sovereign member states working alongside 16 international organizations. It really just proves that setting global data standards today requires a massive, coordinated, multilateral effort. No single country can do it alone. And tying this right back to our broader theme of evolving governance, India has recently been included in this crucial committee. This placement allows the nation to actively participate in shaping the international rules for big data and data science moving forward. It's a huge seat at a very modern table.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to close on. With system-wide UN80 reforms underway, and these rapid, complex transitions happening in human rights, refugee protection, and big data, the landscape of global governance is literally shifting beneath our feet. So how will the growing involvement of member states like India redefine the direction of international governance tomorrow? It's a space we absolutely should all be watching closely. Thanks so much for tuning into this explainer.
Have you ever wondered who actually writes the rules for the global economy? I mean, we interact with it literally every single day, right? When we fill up our cars, buy imported goods, or, even just drop a letter in a mailbox. But behind all of these everyday actions is this massive, kind of invisible architecture of international organizations. So who builds these rules? And how do they actually govern the intricate dance of international trade and energy?
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are on a mission to completely decode the alphabet soup of global organizations. We're going to look really closely at the massive pillars of global connectivity, the economic, trade, and energy institutions that just quietly keep the whole world turning. Here's our roadmap for today. Number 1, setting the trade rules. 2, connecting the Asia-Pacific. 3, regional trade powerhouses. 4, global energy dynamics. And finally, number 5, finance and infrastructure.
All right, Section 1, setting the trade rules.
So when it comes to global commerce, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, acts as the ultimate referee. It was established under the Marrakesh Agreement back in April 1994, and then officially came into existence in 1995 to succeed the much older GATT system from 1948. Basically, the WTO provides the rulebook that nations follow to keep trade flowing smoothly. And when disputes pop up, it's the primary venue to resolve them. For instance, we just recently saw Brazil initiate formal consultations at the WTO because of a U.S. decision to impose 50% tariffs on Brazilian imports. By providing a structured arena for these incredibly high-stakes disagreements, the WTO prevents simple trade spats from just spiraling into total economic chaos. And ultimately, that's what keeps the prices of our everyday goods stable.
Moving right along to Section 2, connecting the Asia-Pacific.
Okay, let's dive into this. Notice the massive geographical scale of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC for short.
Established in 1989, it brings together 21 members from all across the Asia-Pacific region, literally bridging the Americas with Asia and Australasia. It is a completely staggering footprint, and it really highlights the sheer volume of global trade passing through these waters and borders.
Now, what's really fascinating is how APEC actually operates. They use the term economies instead of countries or nations. Why? Well, it's a very deliberate choice to bypass territorial and political disputes. That way, everyone can focus strictly on economic and trade collaboration. And this focus on consensus and voluntary participation was on full display recently when leaders gathered in Gyeongju, South Korea for the 2025 APEC Summit. There, they adopted the Gyeongju Declaration to strengthen regional economic interdependence.
That brings us to Section 3, Regional Trade Powerhouses. So, as nations form tighter, more integrated economic blocs to boost their local markets, a great example to look at is Mercosur. Established in 1991, its founding members are the South American heavyweights, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. By forming this bloc, they massively amplified their negotiating power on the world stage, and we're currently seeing a prime example of this global outreach. India and Brazil recently agreed to expand the scope of their existing preferential trade agreement under the Mercosur bloc. They're aiming to unlock even more sectors and products for cross-border trade. For us, the everyday consumers, this kind of expansion usually means a much wider variety of imported goods on our store shelves.
But South America definitely isn't the only place where massive regional integration is happening. Consider this figure for a second. $6.5 trillion. That is the combined GDP of our next trade powerhouse. Yep, that $6.5 trillion GDP belongs to the Eurasian Economic Union, or EAU. This economic union comprises Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. We're talking about a massive market of nearly 200 million people here. The EAEU pursues the free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor among all its members. Recognizing this massive potential, India recently signed the terms of reference in Moscow to launch negotiations on a free trade agreement with the EAU. And for India, this isn't just about market access. It's a deeply strategic move aimed at securing long-term energy contracts and diversifying its trade partnerships.
All right, Section 4, Global Energy Dynamics.
You know, we really can't talk about the global economy without talking about the fuel that literally powers it. The global energy market is balanced by these massive counterweights, and their history is a fascinating story of cause and effect. Back in 1960, OPEC was established in Baghdad by major oil-producing nations. Fast forward to the 1973 oil crisis, major oil exporting countries restricted supply, causing massive economic shocks that a lot of people still remember today. The direct reaction to that? The creation of the IEA in 1974 by industrialized nations to protect themselves. Then, zooming ahead to 2016, we saw another major shift as OPEC evolved into OPEC Plus to expand its market influence.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dynamic tension in the energy market. On one side, you have the IEA, which is totally focused on the consumer. Their mandate is to prevent global disruptions, and they actually require member countries to maintain minimum strategic oil reserves for emergencies. It's basically a massive safety net. Then on the other side, you have OPEC, which is focused on the producer. Their objective is to coordinate petroleum supply to ensure stable prices and a steady income for oil-producing nations. It is a constant, ongoing balancing act between buyers wanting stability and sellers wanting fair value.
Now, the IEA is administered by the OECD framework, and it's actively growing. In February 2026, Colombia officially became its 33rd member. Furthermore, India, which became an associate member back in 2017, formally applied for full membership in October 2023, and that bid has now entered its final stage. This is a massive shift, guys, bringing one of the world's absolute largest energy consumers fully into the IEA fold.
Meanwhile, the producer side is shifting too. OPEC Plus expanded the original group by allying with 10 other major oil-producing countries, most notably Russia, to strengthen their collective influence. And their reach just keeps growing. The Brazilian government actually approved joining OPEC Plus in 2025, marking Brazil's emergence as a major global oil exporter. Decisions made by this bloc immediately impact global prices. I mean, it directly affects what you pay at the pump. A perfect example is their recent agreement in principle to a modest oil output increase following U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran and the resulting supply disruptions over in West Asia.
And finally, Section 5, Finance and Infrastructure. Let's look at the ultimate safety nets and the physical infrastructure underpinning all of this. We'll start with the safety net, $1 billion.
That is the massive, immediate financial disbursement the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, just approved to support the financial stability of Pakistan. But you have to understand, this isn't just some simple cash handout.
This $1 billion was provided under the IMF's Extended Fund Facility, or EFF. Unlike a short-term bailout that's just meant to plug a temporary leak, the EFF targets countries suffering from medium-term balance of payments problems. We're talking about issues caused by deep structural deficiencies in their economies. It's a loan mechanism that strictly requires nations to commit to and actually implement significant structural reforms that, frankly, take a lot of time to yield results. Honestly, it's the economic equivalent of undergoing intense physical therapy rather than just slapping a bandage on a broken bone.
Okay, pivoting from global finance to physical, tangible connections, let's talk about the recent 28th Universal Postal Congress that opened in Dubai.
Now, what is truly fascinating about this is the sheer history. The Universal Postal Union, or UPU, which organizes this Congress, was established all the way back in 1874 by the Treaty of Berne. Today, it is a specialized UN agency with 192 member countries. It's literally one of the oldest and largest global organizations in existence. The UPU is that invisible framework that ensures a package sent from a tiny town in India can seamlessly navigate global borders and arrive right at a doorstep in Canada. It's a true testament to enduring global cooperation that directly touches all of our lives.
And that brings us to a really critical question. We've looked at massive global institutions like the WTO and the UN agencies, but we've also seen the rapid, undeniable expansion of regional blocs like Mercosur, the EAU, and OPEC+. So as these regional carpool lanes grow stronger and tighter, is the era of broad global consensus ending, or is it simply evolving into a network of highly powerful regional alliances? That is the major dynamic shaping the future of our global economy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring these incredible global dynamics. I'll catch you next time.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here with me today. We're looking at something totally fascinating, a topic that literally dictates the flow of global power and economics. Our focus today is the spectrum of strategy, Asian security groupings, and the Indo-Pacific. Now, if you've ever glanced at global news and felt completely overwhelmed by the alphabet soup of international relations, the SCOs, the ASEANs, the AUKUSes, don't worry. In today's explainer, we're going to untangle all that complex acronym soup and make it visually clear, structured, and super easy to grasp.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Decoding the complex web of international relations isn't just about reading dry treaties and border disputes. Nations today are navigating intense regional tensions using a massive, varied toolkit. They're utilizing everything on the spectrum, from subtle cultural diplomacy and shared music festivals, all the way up to highly classified multi-billion-dollar nuclear submarine pacts. It's like a giant high-stakes chessboard, and every single move matters.
Here is our geopolitical roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, diplomatic ties on cultural bonds. Then 2, regional maritime security. 3, the Indo-Pacific counterweights. 4, advanced defense and submarines. And we'll wrap up with number 5, complex Eurasian dynamics.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, diplomatic ties and cultural bonds.
So, BIMSTEC. It stands for the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know. But here's why this specific group is so interesting right now. BIMSTEC recently hosted its first ever traditional music festival. This actually brought together musicians from 7 distinct nations: Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. This is the absolute unifying power of soft power in action. You bring people together over shared heritage and music to build underlying trust well before you ever sit down to negotiate complex technical or economic issues. Let's move along and see how this builds. Because, diplomacy is a very long game. We can literally trace the evolution of the India-ASEAN relationship over 30 years. Back in 1992, India started out simply as a sectoral dialogue partner. 4 years later, in 1996, that elevated to a full dialogue partner. Fast forward to 2012, it became a strategic partnership, and most recently in 2022, it was upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. You can really see the decades of deliberate, steady bricklaying required to build deep trust in Southeast Asia. And that long-term, patient, diplomatic effort brings us to major, high-level forums like the 20th East Asia Summit. Here are the key facts you need to know. This summit recently adopted the Kuala Lumpur Declaration, which formally reaffirms a joint commitment to regional peace and stability. What started back in 2005 with 16 original member states has grown massively in strategic weight. It's a leaders-led forum, and its importance is really highlighted by the fact that global heavyweights like the US and Russia both joined the table back in 2011.
Moving right along to Section 2, Regional Maritime Security.
A perfect example of this localized security is the Colombo Security Conclave, or CSC. Bangladesh has officially joined as the 5th full member state. Meanwhile, Seychelles is now participating as an observer state, and Malaysia has joined as a guest. To give you a little context, this was formed back in 2011, originally as just a trilateral maritime grouping between India, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. The addition of a major nation like Bangladesh significantly strengthens this maritime security grouping right in the Indian Ocean.
So why does this group actually exist? Well, the CSC relies on 5 core pillars: maritime security, counterterrorism, transnational crime, cybersecurity, and humanitarian assistance. So the crucial question is, why do these specific pillars matter to you and me? Because these are the exact areas of cooperation required to secure vital regional supply chains. Stability in these waters directly impacts the safe transit of global shipping, which ultimately affects the cost and availability of goods all over the world.
All right, turning up the heat a bit with Section 3, the Indo-Pacific counterweights. First up in this arena is a brand new grouping called the Squad Alliance. This is an informal, multilateral alliance formed just in 2024, comprising Australia, Japan, the Philippines, and the United States. Its specific aim is to provide strategic responses to maritime tensions, particularly focusing on the Philippines waters and the highly contested South China Sea.
Now, what's really interesting here is the direct comparison between the Quad and the Squad. You've almost certainly heard of the Quad, comprising the US, Japan, Australia, and India. Well, the Quad focuses on maintaining a broader, free, and open Indo-Pacific, but the Squad swaps India out and brings the Philippines in. This perfectly isolates the key difference in their architecture. The Quad is a wide regional framework, whereas the Squad is a highly localized alliance, specifically zooming in to address immediate dynamics in the South China Sea.
Speaking of the Quad, it remains highly active. The 10th Quad Foreign Ministers meeting in Washington recently announced new initiatives to further strengthen that free and open Indo-Pacific. It's really important to understand how these architectures work. The Quad doesn't have a permanent secretariat or a binding collective defense obligation like NATO does. Instead, they project power and build trust through joint cohesion, like participating together in the massive Malabar naval exercises. Let's shift into high gear. Section 4, Advanced Defense and Submarines. Enter the Geelong Treaty. This is a historic 50-year bilateral commitment between the UK and Australia, functioning under the broader AUKUS agreement. The core focus here? Nuclear-powered submarines. The magnitude of this treaty really cannot be overstated. We're looking at a half-century timeline that involves the sharing of some of the most highly sensitive, closely guarded nuclear technology on the entire planet. Let's break down the 2 core steps of this treaty clearly, just so you can grasp exactly what AUKUS is aiming to do. Step 1 is to enable Australia's acquisition of conventionally armed, nuclear-powered submarines. Note that distinction. The weapons are conventional, but the incredible propulsion systems are nuclear. Step 2 goes beyond just the submarines. It's a broader commitment to ensure cooperation in developing and providing advanced defense capabilities to promote overall security and stability across the Indo-Pacific region. And here is the absolute massive takeaway for this section. Through this deal, Australia becomes only the 2nd country ever, after Britain, to receive this level of nuclear submarine technology from Washington. This brilliantly illustrates a massive, generational shift in global military trust and power distribution. I mean, the United States doesn't just hand this level of technology out lightly. Doing so signals a monumental strategic pivot to empower key allies in the Pacific. Finally, we land on Section 5, Complex Eurasian Dynamics. We turn our attention now to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO. Formed originally from the Shanghai Five back in 1996, it's now a major Eurasian intergovernmental organization focused heavily on regional development, economics, and security issues. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer, staggering vastness of the SCO's geography. It stretches from Russia and China down through Central Asia to India and Pakistan, and recently expanding to include Iran.
When you consider this massive footprint, you can immediately see how structurally complex it must be to get all these incredibly diverse nations, many with their own historical border tensions, onto the exact same strategic page. And that geographic and political complexity brings us directly to a really critical quote. India refused to sign the joint declaration at the SCO defense ministers meeting in Qingdao, citing dissatisfaction with a lack of reference to cross-border terrorism. We're looking at this impartially to highlight a very real reality of international relations. Membership in a high-level organization absolutely does not equal total strategic alignment. There are real, deeply felt internal tensions within the SCO, proving that the diplomatic table can often be just as contested and complicated as the borders themselves.
So we've traveled all the way from the unifying soft power of traditional music festivals to the absolute hard power reality of nuclear submarines. With unprecedented new treaties being signed and decades-old alliances being tested internally, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Will this incredibly complex, overlapping web of security pacts succeed in preventing conflict, or is it simply redrawing the battle lines for the future? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope the structured look sparked your curiosity and made the topic accessible, and I can't wait to keep learning and untangling these shifting global dynamics with you next time.
Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer, where we're going to unpack something absolutely fascinating. We're looking at how the world's power structures are rapidly, and I mean fundamentally, reorganizing themselves right in front of our eyes. I mean, think about it. From the revitalization of the Weimar Triangle over in Europe to ECOWAS facing some pretty significant member withdrawals in West Africa, the global landscape is shifting from these old, rigid alliances to brand new, dynamic coalitions. And today, we are going to decode exactly how and why that's happening.
To make sense of this complex alphabet soup of geopolitics, we've broken it down into 5 clear pieces. We'll hit the global heavyweights, the spirit of Ubuntu, the rise of the global south, the roots of non-alignment, and finally, the future of diplomacy.
Starting off with Section 1, the global heavyweights and their contrasting priorities. Because to understand where we're going, we really have to compare the traditional top tables of global governance with the newer forms challenging the status quo.
First up, let's talk about the G7, the Group of Seven. Formed way back in 1975, this grouping represents the world's advanced Western economies plus the European Union. Now, at the recent Outreach Summit in Kananaskis, Canada, their theme was protecting our communities around the world. Notice that phrasing for a second. It's a highly defensive, protective posture, right? They're focusing heavily on things like securing energy sources and managing the digital transition in the middle of all this global instability.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that while the G7 holds immense historical and economic power, they only represent about 30% of the global economy by GDP. And when it comes to the world's population, just 10%. So, it's a highly concentrated, incredibly exclusive table. Contrast that directly with the 20th G20 summit held in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2025. The G20 includes the world's largest economies, but crucially, and this is a real game changer, it now gives a seat to both the European Union and the African Union. And look at their theme: solidarity, equality, sustainability. That represents a massive shift toward a much more inclusive perspective, one that specifically focuses on the priorities and the voice of the Global South.
Let's punch in the economic reality here, because it is undeniable. The G20 commands a staggering 85% of global GDP. They handle 75% of global trade and represent a full 2/3 of the human population. Make no mistake, this is the definitive heavyweight table today.
Moving right along to Section 2, the spirit of Ubuntu, a thematic shift, because that 2025 G20 summit wasn't just about economics, it was actually driven by a fundamental shift in ideology.
The summit was heavily guided by what's called the spirit of Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu is a profound African philosophy emphasizing our shared humanity. It translates beautifully to "I am because we are." It's centered entirely on cooperation, compassion, and collective well-being. And you can see how this dramatically contrasts with traditional international relations, which, let's be honest, have historically been driven by self-interest and zero-sum competition.
To give you a really concrete historical anchor for this abstract philosophy, just look at Nelson Mandela. He perfectly exemplified Ubuntu through his peaceful leadership during South Africa's extremely difficult transition from apartheid. By promoting unity, forgiveness, and social harmony over revenge, Mandela showed the world exactly what Ubuntu looks like in actionable political practice. And it's this exact spirit that the Global South is bringing to modern problem solving.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, Rise of the Global South, Building New Tables.
Because if traditional Western-led forums aren't fully representing the interests of developing nations, well, what happens? They just go out and build their own institutional power.
A fantastic example of this in action is the IBSA Forum. This brings together India, Brazil, and South Africa. What's absolutely incredible here is that you have three major democracies from three completely different continents, Asia, South America, and Africa, coordinating on big global political issues. They institutionalized back in 2003, but they operate completely without some rigid, permanent secretariat. It's totally decentralized. Yet, through the IBSA Fund, they actually managed to fund poverty eradication and hunger programs in least developed countries. It's such a powerful model of South-South cooperation.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an even larger coalition with the evolution of BRICS. It started out merely as a catchy financial acronym coined by Goldman Sachs back in 2001 for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But by 2009, they're holding their first real summit. In 2010, South Africa joins the club. Fast forward to 2024, and we see a massive expansion adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And then in 2025, Indonesia officially became a full member. What we're watching is a steady, historical snowball effect of emerging economies grouping together.
And the result of all that expansion is honestly staggering. As an impartial data point here, the BRICS nations now represent 49.5% of the global population. Think about that for a second. Almost half of the entire human race, and roughly 40% of the global GDP, is now encapsulated in this single grouping. This significantly alters the global balance of power for sure, creating a genuine multipolar dynamic.
Now here's where we get an aha moment in Section 4, Roots of Non-Alignment, a 70-year journey. Because it's really easy to look at BRICS or IBSA today and think, wow, this is a brand new phenomenon. But it isn't. Today's multipolar push has deep, historical roots stretching back exactly 7 decades. Take a look at the historic 1955 Bandung Conference held in Indonesia. We recently observed the 70th anniversary of this remarkable event. It was right there that 29 newly independent Asian and African nations gathered together. In a world completely dominated by massive superpowers, they stood up and demanded a collective voice, strongly opposing colonialism and imperialism.
And this brilliantly illustrates the philosophical divide of that era. On one side, you had the Cold War superpowers pressuring the entire world into these binary us versus them alliances. But on the other side, the non-aligned movement emerged from Bandung as a flat-out refusal to identify with either major superpower. They chose instead to actively promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation. This movement was officially formalized in 1961 in Belgrade by leaders like Sukarno, Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, and Tito. And just like IBSA today, the non-aligned movement relies entirely on shared values. There's no formal headquarters, no charter, no binding treaty. Yet, even today, it remains the second largest grouping of nations in the world, sitting right behind the United Nations. So this desire for strategic autonomy, it's not new at all. It's just finding new forms.
That brings us to our final segment. Section 5, the future of diplomacy, science, and strategy. So how is diplomacy itself actually evolving in response to all these shifting alliances and the rapid breakneck pace of modern technology?
For a glimpse into the future, we look to the 11th Raisina Dialogue, held annually in New Delhi. This is India's flagship conference on geopolitics and geoeconomics. It brings together leaders from politics, business, media, and civil society to address global instability. Forums exactly like this are quickly becoming the modern town squares, where the rules of a multipolar world are being negotiated in real time.
So the crucial point is what actually emerged from this latest dialogue. The Raisina Science Diplomacy Initiative, or SDI. This initiative acknowledges a harsh new reality. Going forward, global foreign policy isn't just going to be about military treaties or shipping lanes. It is inextricably linked to technological innovation. Securing AI, protecting semiconductors, controlling digital supply chains, that is now the very core of global power and diplomacy.
This delicate navigation of the future is perfectly captured in the theme for the upcoming 2026 Raisina Dialogue, Samskara, Assertion, Accommodation, Advancement. It's just a beautiful summary of the tightrope that rising nations have to walk right now. They have to assert their own interests, accommodate new realities and partners, and continuously advance their technological and economic development on the world stage. It's a huge balancing act.
Which leaves us with a critical thought to end our explainer on today. With massive demographic and economic power shifting firmly toward the global south and technology fundamentally rewriting how foreign policy is even conducted, we have to ask ourselves,
Can traditional, exclusive alliances actually survive our multipolar future? Whether it's the Weimar Triangle trying to reassert itself in Europe or ECOWAS dealing with member withdrawals in Africa, are we entering an era where only flexible, inclusive coalitions will thrive? Really think on that the next time you look at a world map. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever actually stopped to wonder what keeps the massive, chaotic machinery of the world humming along? We're constantly seeing sovereign nations acting entirely on their own, doing their own thing, right? But honestly, behind the scenes, there's this wildly complex, almost invisible code running in the background. It's kind of like a global operating system, just this massive network of international laws, treaties, and institutions silently governing how countries interact, trade, and even settle their disputes. And today, we're going to decode that entire system.
When you turn on the news, global politics can feel like, well, an absolute alphabet soup of acronyms. You're constantly hearing about the UN, the FAF, the ICC, the IMO. It gets super dizzying for sure. But think about it this way. If international law is the operating system of the world, then these specific organizations are basically the apps running on that system. Every single one has a highly specialized function built to tackle a really unique global problem. We're talking everything from hunting down stolen ancient artifacts to regulating the massive shipping lanes that quite literally bring goods right to your front door.
Okay, to make sense of all this, we're going to break today's explainer down into 4 core pillars of the global order. First up, global justice and mediation. Second, fighting illicit global finance. Third is safeguarding democracy and culture. And finally, governing the high seas. Let's get right into it.
Pillar number 1, global justice and mediation, the courts of the world.
Now, this is absolutely crucial because people constantly confuse these two institutions, the International Criminal Court, or ICC, and the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. The biggest difference is who they actually go after. The ICC prosecutes individual people. So we're talking individuals accused of horrific acts like genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But the ICJ, they settle legal arguments between entire nations, like border disputes or treaty violations. And look at the membership differences too. The ICJ covers literally all 193 UN member states. The ICC, on the other hand, operates under the Rome Statute and only has 125 states on board. Interestingly enough, major global players like the US, Russia, China, and India are actually not members of the ICC.
But the landscape of global justice isn't static, it's constantly evolving. Enter the International Organization for Mediation, or IOMED. Launched formally in Hong Kong in 2025, this is a China-led initiative that brings a completely different model to the table for solving conflicts. Instead of the traditional adversarial Western-style courtrooms where one side wins and the other loses through a long litigation process, IOMED is actually the world's very first intergovernmental legal organization strictly dedicated to mediation. It's basically a brand new app on our global operating system, putting the focus entirely on alternative dispute resolution.
Moving on to pillar number 2, fighting illicit global finance, policing the money.
So we're shifting gears here from grand courtrooms to the invisible, lightning-fast flow of global capital. I mean, think about it for a second. With literally trillions of dollars zipping across electronic borders every single day, who is actually policing the global financial system? How on earth do we make sure that the money flowing through major global banks isn't secretly funding a terrorist organization or, say, laundering the profits of some transnational crime syndicate?
Well, the answer to that is the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. They were established back in 1989 by the G7, and they act as the ultimate financial watchdog for the world. Originally, they were just focused on money laundering, but after 2001, they expanded their mandate to directly tackle terrorist financing too. Today, the FATF has 40 members, which includes India, and I cannot overstate this, they wield an immense amount of quiet, behind-the-scenes power over the entire global economy.
The really fascinating part is how the FATF actually enforces its rules. I mean, they don't have a military, they have lists. First, you have the blacklist. This is for non-cooperative countries or territories, basically nations that are actively supporting terror funding or money laundering. If a country lands on this list, like Iran has for failing to adopt sufficient anti-money laundering standards, it completely isolates their economy. It effectively cuts them off from global banking. Then you have the gray list. This acts as a strict global warning for countries that are seen as safe havens for illicit finance. Getting gray-listed means strict monitoring, and it can heavily restrict foreign investment. Honestly, it's just a brilliantly effective, high-stakes system of economic leverage.
All right, pillar number 3, safeguarding democracy and culture, protecting shared values. 35. This number right here represents the total member countries of a deeply influential but honestly often overlooked organization known as International IDEA. Now, 35 might seem kind of small when you compare it to something like the UN, but the scale of this democratic coalition's impact, it's massive.
Established in 1995, International IDEA is an intergovernmental body totally committed to strengthening inclusive, resilient, and accountable democratic institutions all over the world. They provide the research, the frameworks, and the on-the-ground support to make elections fair and governments more accountable to their people. And a really cool detail to note here is that India, which is a founding member and obviously a country with just massive electoral expertise, is stepping up to assume the chairship of the Council of Member States for International IDEA in 2026.
But safeguarding shared values isn't just about how we vote, right? It's also about protecting our heritage. Take a look at this incredible concept from UNESCO, the Virtual Museum of Stolen Cultural Objects. This is actually the very first global tech platform designed specifically to raise awareness about the illicit trafficking of cultural property. By using advanced technology, these international organizations are engaging younger audiences to help identify and recover stolen historical artifacts. It just goes to show how global institutions are constantly innovating to protect our shared past.
And finally, pillar number 4, governing the high seas, rules of the oceans.
So we've covered courts, we've covered money, and we've covered democracy. But what about the physical trade routes that actually keep the world running? Let's just look at the Indian Ocean for a second. That one body of water carries half of all global container traffic, a third of bulk cargo, and 2/3 of the entire world's oil shipments. If these waters were just some lawless free-for-all, the global supply chain would literally collapse overnight. So how do you regulate something that vast and that inherently international?
This is where the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, comes in, and it's a brilliant example of global governance. Set up after a 1948 UN conference, the IMO is the specialized UN agency responsible for keeping shipping safe and secure, while also preventing massive marine and atmospheric pollution. They've currently got 176 member states, and they create these universally adopted regulatory frameworks. Basically, they are the reason that big shipping operators can't just cut corners to save a few bucks at the expense of human safety and the environment.
And to really grasp just how comprehensive the IMO's oversight is, look at the life cycle of a single cargo ship. They aren't just telling you how to steer the boat. The IMO's measures cover Step 1, the safety standards for the initial design and construction of the ship. Then, Step 2, strict rules for its day-to-day operation and the emissions it pumps out on the open ocean. And finally, Step 3, the sustainable disposal and recycling of the vessel when it's reached the end of its life. It's literal end-to-end global governance.
Now, let's take a step back and see how all of this builds into the larger picture of our global system. We've gone through all these incredible institutions today. You've got the FATF tracking illicit money, the IMO securing the seas, the ICC prosecuting war crimes. But I want you to think about this quote regarding the International Criminal Court. The ICC does not have its own police force and relies on state cooperation for arrests and extraditions.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of this entire global operating system. Are these international institutions truly powerful if they rely almost entirely on the voluntary cooperation of the exact same sovereign nations they're trying to govern? I mean, they don't have a standing army, there's no global police force backing them up. Their power exists simply because the nations of the world collectively agree that having rules, even rules they might disagree with sometimes, is fundamentally better than the absolute chaos of having none at all. It's a wildly delicate, complex balance. So what do you think? Does this system need a radical update? Or is this kind of voluntary cooperation literally the only way a free world can actually function? Something to think about. Keep exploring, and I'll see you on the next explainer.
Welcome to This Explainer. You know, if you look at the world today, you quickly realize that geopolitics isn't really just about borders anymore. It's about connections. Today, we're unpacking the totally fascinating, super high-stakes world of global connectivity and the physical arteries that keep our modern world pumping.
So let's just ground ourselves for a second. What exactly do we mean when we say transport corridor? Well, it's way more than just a single paved road or a shipping lane. We're talking about a massive, deeply integrated network of land and sea routes. Honestly, think of them as the vascular system of global commerce. Because they don't just move consumer goods, right? They're moving energy, critical resources, and, perhaps most importantly, they are moving strategic influence across the entire planet.
We have a seriously fascinating journey ahead of us today. We're going to cover the ancient trade routes, China's Grand Belt strategy, India and the IMEC, Strategic Ports and Railways, and finally, the New Polar Route. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the ancient trade routes.
Now, you might think bridging complex terrains for economic exchange is a totally modern concept, but actually, scratch that, it's been happening for centuries. Just look at the ancient Tea-Horse Road. Our sources highlight this historic trade network that wound its way all the way from southwest China, straight through the brutal landscape of Tibet, and down into parts of India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. This massive web of connectivity actually started way back in the Tang Dynasty, so between 618 and 907 CE. It really just proves that this drive to connect, trade, and bridge geographic divides, that's deeply, fundamentally embedded in human history.
Let's fast forward a bit. Section 2, China's Grand Belt Strategy.
Bringing it to the modern era, the sheer scale of China's ambition to create a vast network of land and sea routes is honestly staggering. Launched back in 2013 by President Xi, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, was originally called One Belt, One Road. It's essentially built on two massive pillars. You have the Overland Silk Road Economic Belt, which focuses heavily on Eurasian energy and infrastructure, and then you have the Maritime Silk Road, aiming for massive sea route connectivity. And the ultimate goal of the whole shebang? To physically link Asia, the Gulf region, Africa, and Europe into one massive cohesive trading bloc.
A super crucial part of the strategy is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Launched in 2015, this is widely considered the absolute flagship project of the entire BRI. It aims to create a direct physical link from Pakistan's Gwadar port all the way up to Kashgar in northwest China. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar endeavor meant to accelerate energy, transport, and industrial cooperation directly to the Arabian Sea, totally bypassing those older, much slower maritime choke points.
Which brings us to Section 3, India and the IMEC and the multilateral response.
Okay, so here's where the geopolitical chessboard gets really interesting. Our sources highlight some sharply contrasting strategies here. For instance, India has been severely critical of CPEC because the route literally passes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which obviously raises huge sovereignty issues. Plus, there are reported concerns globally over the economic viability of some BRI projects, leading to potential debt trap situations, like what we saw in Sri Lanka. And actually, that's exactly why India is actively countering with its own strategic investments there, like renovating Sri Lanka's Kankasantharai port. As an alternative to that unilateral BRI model, we now have the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, which takes a decidedly multilateral approach. Announced as this landmark project at the 2023 G20 summit, it involves a massive coalition. India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the EU, France, Germany, Italy, and the US. It's designed to stimulate economic integration through a combined railway and sea route. So it's a very collaborative, multi-nation strategy to tackle global connectivity.
Let's zoom in on the specific details in Section 4, Strategic Ports and Railways. So, how does a country physically bypass a neighbor it's at odds with? Well, India found a way around Pakistan to access Central Asia and the Persian Gulf. By establishing a sea route from its western coast directly to Chabahar port in Iran, India connects right into Afghanistan via the Zaranj-Dilaram highway, which, by the way, India actually built. It's a pretty perfect visual representation of strategic geography in action.
The absolute strategic power of this single port cannot be overstated. It's a massive puzzle piece for regional dominance. Chabahar is Iran's only deep-sea port with direct access to the ocean, but crucially, it sits a mere 170 kilometers west of Pakistan's Gwadar port, which is the hub of China's CPEC. By utilizing Chabahar, India doesn't just reduce its dependence on the Suez Canal and cut transport times, it actively secures a direct trade route with Afghanistan through a 2016 agreement and establishes a really strong strategic counterbalance to those shifting maritime influences in the region.
But hey, it's not all about the oceans, right? Securing land-based connectivity is just as vital. Take a look at how India is laying down tracks with neighbors like Bhutan. Two key rail projects originating from a 2005 agreement really stand out. First, you've got the 69-kilometer Kokrajhar-Galipulan connecting Bhutan to Assam, India, which was literally declared a special railway project to fast-track its development. Beside it, there's the 20-kilometer Banerhat-Samse line connecting Bhutan directly to West Bengal. It just goes to show that while those grand multi-continent maritime routes get all the headlines, laying down localized steel tracks across borders is absolutely crucial for real integrated regional trade.
Finally, let's head north for Section 5, the New Polar Route.
This one feels almost like science fiction. Because of melting ice in the Arctic, we are now seeing the operational launch of a corridor that could radically shift global shipping dynamics forever. It's called the Polar Silk Road, envisioned as a blue economic corridor, and it's actually the newest extension of China's BRI. By relying on the northern sea route along the coast of Russia, it's attempting to develop actively navigable routes straight through the Arctic Ocean. This essentially connects East Asia directly to North America and Western Europe through waters that, until very recently, were completely impassable.
And to put that into perspective, this isn't just theoretical anymore. Take the recent voyage of the commercial vessel Istanbul Bridge. It departed from Ningbo Shaojian, navigated those freezing, newly opened Arctic waters, and arrived in the UK in just 18 days. Our sources highlight that this is drastically faster and, frankly, far more cost-effective than taking the traditional route all the way down through the Suez Canal. We are witnessing a total operational shift in global logistics.
So, to kind of wrap up everything we've talked about today in this explainer, we really have to realize that these ports, railways, and newly thawed ice routes, they are the modern tools of global diplomacy. As our sources state, the race for global connectivity is not just about moving goods, it is about cementing geopolitical influence through the very vascular routes of the planet. Whether it's the multilateral cooperation of the IMEEC, the massive unilateral scale of the BRI, or the highly strategic placement of Chabahar Port, the nations that control the corridors shape the future.
I want to leave you with this one thought to ponder, as the entire landscape of global commerce evolves right before our eyes. As melting ice opens the Arctic and massive new multinational economic corridors are signed into reality, how will these shifting alliances redraw the map of global trade over the next century? It's a massive question, but understanding these transport corridors puts you one step closer to the answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.
All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. If you've been paying any attention to international relations lately, you've definitely noticed a massive flurry of diplomatic activity coming out of New Delhi. We aren't just talking about standard, run-of-the-mill diplomatic visits here. What we are actually witnessing is a highly strategic, systematic overhaul of how India conducts trade, secures foreign investments, and tackles really complex global challenges. These absolutely aren't just photo ops. This is a massive shift that directly impacts global supply chains, the cost of everyday goods, and the future of the job market. So today, we're going to unpack the exact mechanisms making this new era possible. We're tracking what we're calling the global handshake today. And as you can see, this isn't just a localized effort. It's a momentum that is sweeping all the way from Europe down into Oceania, pivoting through the Middle East, and reaching right into Southeast Asia. Every single handshake, every new pact we're talking about today is basically transforming traditional diplomacy into highly tangible, strategic bridges that bring massive economic and security benefits to the table. Now, to keep us from getting bogged down in endless legal jargon, here is our quick itinerary. We've got 4 main stops today: blockbuster trade deals, investment shields, strategic toolkits, and we'll wrap it all up with the global handshake synthesis. Let's get right into it. Stop number 1, blockbuster trade deals, and how India is fueling its revenue engines with the EU and New Zealand. Okay, so the newly negotiated India-EU Free Trade Agreement is widely being referred to as the mother of all deals. And honestly, for good reason. We are talking about 2 economies that together make up 25% of the global GDP. Under this FTA, India secures preferential access to an astounding 97% of the EU's tariff lines. In return, India is opening up 92.1% of its own tariff lines to EU exports. It's a massive two-way street that covers 99.5% of their total trade value. I mean, that is the literal definition of unprecedented economic integration. But the real kicker here is the staggering number right here, $33 billion. That represents the value of India's labor-intensive exports that instantly become duty-free in the European market. Think about things like the clothes you wear or the shoes you buy. Previously, those exact sectors were getting hit with duties anywhere from 4 up to 26%. By wiping out those tariffs completely on day one, this deal injects pure adrenaline into the competitiveness of these industries. It directly fuels employment and heavily locks India into European value chains. Now, traveling down to Oceania, the new India-New Zealand FTA offers a rapid-fire list of tangible perks. India can now export 100% of its goods to New Zealand with 0 customs duties. 0. But at the same time, India successfully kept 30% of its own market, mainly sensitive sectors like dairy and farming, protected to safeguard local agriculture. So it's an incredibly well-balanced deal.
And beyond just moving goods, New Zealand is committing $20 billion in investment over the next 15 years. Plus, for the young professionals and students tuning in, look at these visa opportunities: 4-year post-study visas for PhDs and 1,000 working holiday visas for young Indians. It's just a comprehensive win-win. Moving right along to Section 2, Investment Shields. Here is how India is securing its future with FTA and Israel. I really want this number to sink in for a second. $100 billion. Through the newly launched India EFTA desk, which, by the way, brings together Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, those 4 European nations have committed an earth-shattering $100 billion in foreign direct investment into India over a 15-year period. This dedicated desk was created specifically to seamlessly support EFTA companies operating in India, massively improving their ease of doing business and regulatory access. But here is the brilliant part. This massive investment isn't just some vague, we'll get to it eventually promise. It's legally built on a strict timeline under the TIPA, the Trade and Economic Partnership Agreement. What makes TIPA so revolutionary is that it's the very first FTA signed by India that legally binds its commitments directly to investment flows and job creation. They literally must deliver $50 billion within the first 10 years, and the remaining $50 billion in the 5 years after that. It's an absolute powerhouse of a shield, ensuring long-term economic stability. Okay, before we jump over to the Middle East for our next big example, let's just quickly define what a bilateral investment agreement, or a BIA, actually does. Think of it as the ultimate set of ground rules. It's a formal treaty that ensures if a company from country A invests big money in country B, their assets are legally protected from arbitrary seizures, sudden regulatory nightmares, or unfair treatment. It basically provides the concrete confidence necessary for large-scale global capital to safely cross borders. Which perfectly brings us to Israel. Israel recently became the very first OECD member state to sign an investment treaty under India's totally revamped brand new model framework. You see, back in 2017, India actually terminated an older 1996 treaty with Israel. Why? Because India was undergoing a major policy shift to standardize and strictly safeguard all its global investments. So this new alignment with Israel perfectly demonstrates that modern policy shift in action. It creates a much safer, more predictable environment for capital flow, making India a highly secure bet for international businesses, especially in cutting-edge areas like innovation and infrastructure. All right, on to Section 3, Strategic Toolkits. This is where we look at how India is solving highly specific modern challenges alongside the UK and Singapore.
So partnering with the UK, India has established the Offshore Wind Task Force. Working under their joint Vision 2035, this specific partnership takes the UK's massive, world-leading expertise in wind energy and applies it directly to ecosystem planning, market design, and seabed leasing frameworks in India. This is huge because it isn't just about general trade. It's a targeted, highly actionable solution to one of our most pressing modern climate challenges. It's specifically designed to rapidly develop India's clean offshore wind sector. Now, let's switch gears for a second. Think about a dramatic legal hurdle that every highly connected modern nation eventually faces. As people, money, and data move seamlessly across the globe, unfortunately, crime does too. So the big question is, how do you actually investigate a complex case when your primary suspect, or a crucial piece of evidence, is sitting thousands of miles away in another sovereign country? Well, you don't just cross your fingers and rely on slow, informal diplomatic favors. This is exactly why MLATs exist, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaties. They are formal, binding agreements to ensure that criminals absolutely cannot escape justice simply by crossing a line on a map. An MLAT legally binds countries to share vital evidence, track down key witnesses, and assist in prosecutions. And India currently manages these treaties with over 45 countries, handled directly by the Ministry of Home Affairs. And to see the sheer real-world impact of this, look no further than Singapore. Recently, India actually formally invoked its MLA to seek strict cooperation regarding the investigation into the tragic death of the popular singer Zubeen Garg over in the Southeast Asian country. This brilliantly illustrates how these high-level international agreements are used practically on the ground. It goes way beyond just economic gains to ensure that the due process of law is never, ever sabotaged just for want of cross-border evidence. All right, let's bring it all together. Section 4, the global handshake synthesis and building a truly resilient network. So what does this all mean when you step back? India has successfully engineered a unified, incredibly strategic seat at the global table. From those blockbuster trade deals with the EU and New Zealand that literally wipe out tariffs, to the massive $100 billion investment shields from EFTA, and those highly specialized legal and energy toolkits forged with Singapore and the UK, these aren't just isolated pieces of paper stacked on some diplomat's desk. They are deliberate, deeply interconnected building blocks. India is actively constructing a fiercely resilient, globally connected economy that is protected by international law, heavily fueled by foreign investment, and fully capable of addressing cross-border challenges head-on. So I'm going to leave you with this thought to ponder. As India aggressively weaves this vast new global network, which of these strategic handshakes do you think will define its economic future the most? Will it be the massive volume of European trade, the innovation and investment shields from nations like Israel, or maybe the specialized climate and legal toolkits that ultimately define the next decade of growth? Thank you so much for joining this explainer today. I really hope breaking it down like this helped clarify these massively complex agreements. Keep exploring the connections that shape our world, and we will catch you next time. Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're taking a true zoom-out approach to the globe to see exactly how obscure lines on a map and, frankly, some pretty dusty historical treaties are actively shaping modern power dynamics. I absolutely love diving into this kind of stuff because geopolitics, well, it isn't just about politicians sitting in boardrooms. It's about physical geography, untapped resources, and the strategic footholds that literally dictate the future of our world. So, let's map out our itinerary across the global chessboard for today. First up, India's tense border disputes. Second, strategic bases and islands. Third, flashpoints out in the sea. And finally, some unconventional global power plays. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, India's tense border disputes. Our first stop is a place called Sur Creek. Now, to really understand this dispute, we actually have to rewind all the way back to the 1914 Bombay Resolution. This originally defined the boundary between Sindh, which is now in Pakistan, and Kutch, now in India. So the whole crux of the argument hinges on how international maritime law gets applied today. India relies on what's known as the Thalweg principle. Basically, this states that river boundaries should be drawn right down the middle of the deepest navigable channel. But Pakistan? They argue that Sur Creek is completely non-navigable, meaning that Thalweg principle shouldn't apply at all. And the spatial reality of that legal argument is pretty striking. You've got a red line, which is the boundary claimed by India, running straight down the mid-channel. Contrast that with a green line, resting entirely on the eastern bank, which is claimed by Pakistan. It might sound like a minor mapping discrepancy, but believe me, the stakes here are incredibly high. Because Sur Creek isn't just some desolate stretch of mud. It's actually a massive, 96-kilometer-long tidal estuary extending right into the Arabian Sea. But more importantly, it is one of the absolute largest fishing zones in the entire subcontinent. And to top it all off, it's widely believed to be sitting on some extremely valuable, untapped oil and gas resources. So suddenly, arguing over the exact middle of a creek makes perfect economic sense, right? Now, let's pivot and move high up into the Trans-Karakoram Tract to the Shaksgam Valley and see how this builds into an even larger geopolitical headache. Historically, this area was controlled by Pakistan, but back in a 1963 boundary agreement, Pakistan actually ceded 5,180 square kilometers of this territory to China, and this was done entirely without India's consent, even though talks were ongoing at the time. Fast forward to today, and this valley is seeing massive Chinese infrastructure investments. We're talking over $62 million, primarily to support the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Geographically speaking, it's pretty clear why India objects so strongly to this. India considers all of Jammu and Kashmir, along with Ladakh, to be integral parts of its territory. And, much like how India recently moved to secure its eastern flank by completely overhauling the free movement regime on the Myanmar border, it remains fiercely protective of its territorial sovereignty on all fronts. Because this critical infrastructure corridor in the west passes straight through Pakistan-occupied territory, India views these Chinese projects as totally illegal and unacceptable. It really is a classic example of how infrastructure development gets weaponized to cement territorial claims. Moving on to Section 2, Strategic Bases and Islands. Let's head deep into the central Indian Ocean to a striking horseshoe-shaped coral atoll. That is Diego Garcia, part of the Chagos archipelago. Geographically, it's incredibly isolated, but militarily, it's easily one of the most important locations on Earth. The big takeaway here is the fascinating geopolitical compromise that just recently unfolded. For decades, the UK administered these islands. But in 2019, the International Court of Justice stepped in, ruled that the UK's decolonization was incomplete, and ordered an end to their administration. Eventually, the UK agreed to transfer sovereignty back to Mauritius. But, and this is a huge but, they managed to secure a 99-year lease to keep the joint UK-US military base on Diego Garcia fully operational. Talk about a masterclass in conceding sovereignty while still retaining hard strategic power. Now, while the US and UK are tightly holding on to their Indian Ocean outposts, India's posture has actually contracted a bit. Historically, India used overseas outposts to project influence against major powers. For instance, at its peak, India had around 200 personnel and Sukhoi jets stationed at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. But they withdrew them right before the Taliban's return in 2021. They've also pulled out of the Ani Air Base in Tajikistan. So as it stands today, India currently operates no fully functional overseas military bases, choosing instead to focus heavily on strategic airstrips closer to home, like down Mauritius.
All right, Section 3. Flashpoints in the sea. The Scarborough Shoal is pretty much a textbook example of modern maritime conflict. Both the Philippines and China claim this area. However, following a really tense naval standoff over a decade ago, back in 2012, China has essentially maintained effective control of the shoal, heavily patrolling it with their Coast Guard and fishing vessels. The crucial thing to understand here is the massive contrast between international rulings and the actual tactics playing out on the water. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration actually ruled that China's blockade violated international law, officially recognizing the shoal as a traditional fishing ground for the Philippines. But look at China's recent tactical pivot. They've just approved a sprawling 3,524-hectare nature reserve right on top of the coral reef. By branding it as an environmental protection zone, they're using an incredibly clever administrative tactic to literally cement their physical control over contested waters. It's wild. And finally, Section 4, Unconventional Global Power Plays. So here's a question for you. Why does a single diplomatic nod from a country like Israel actually matter for the delicate balance of power in the Horn of Africa? Well, let's look at Somaliland. It's been an effectively autonomous and remarkably stable region since 1991, right after Somalia's descent into civil war. Yet for over 3 decades, it has totally lacked broad international recognition, mainly because Somalia so strongly opposes it. But recently, Israel made a huge move, becoming the first nation to formally recognize Somaliland's independence. This is an absolute game changer, because Somaliland hopes this will finally break the ice, encouraging other nations to follow suit. That would drastically boost their global diplomatic credentials and finally grant them that much-needed access to international economic markets. Jumping all the way from the Horn of Africa up to the freezing Arctic, former U.S. President Donald Trump made some serious international waves when he floated the idea that the United States should just outright acquire Greenland, specifically citing defense purposes. Now, while that sounded completely shocking to a lot of people, the U.S. has actually had a long-standing historical interest in the territory ever since they bought Alaska. Just consider this tiny number for a second. 57,000. That represents the entire population of Greenland. Think about that. It is the world's absolute largest island, practically the size of a continent, and it is inhabited by just 57,000 people. But Greenland is a lot more than just a giant block of ice. It is an incredibly vital Arctic stronghold, absolutely packed with untapped natural resources. Now, of course, Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom, and Denmark very quickly and very firmly rejected any informal offers of a U.S. buyout. But it's really important to note that Greenland is already covered by Denmark's membership in the NATO military alliance. So it's already thoroughly integrated right into Western defense structures anyway. Geographically speaking, holding or even heavily influencing Greenland gives a nation unparalleled projection into the North Atlantic Ocean. It acts as the ultimate geographic buffer zone between North America and Europe. And as those Arctic shipping routes continue to open up due to climate change, Greenland becomes a permanent, non-negotiable fixture of Western military security. So we've seen today how seemingly obscure, muddy estuaries in South Asia, tiny coral atolls in the Indian Ocean, and frozen, sparsely populated islands in the Arctic are all actively shaping our global power dynamics. Geopolitics literally never sleeps, which leaves us with one massive question. As climate change and new economic corridors continue to shift our world, which of these remote lines on the map will be the next flashpoint that rewrites our geopolitical future?
Keep your eyes on the map, folks, because the board is always moving. Welcome to The Explainer. I am thrilled you're joining us today. So let's just dive right in, because the world, it is undergoing a massive transformation right now. We are watching nations rapidly rearrange their borders. But, not really in the physical sense. They're actually rewriting the rules of entry, basing them on wealth, highly specific technical skills, and deep historical ties. Today, we're going to unpack exactly how global migration, visas, and diaspora affairs are shifting right beneath our feet.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll cover 1. The elite visa race. 2. Tech gateways and hurdles. 3. Controlling the borders. 4. Ending historical labor systems. And finally, 5. Diaspora roots and residency.
All right, Section 1, the elite visa race, buying borders and exclusive access.
$1 million. Now, that's not a suggested retirement fund or a stock tip. That is the literal upfront price tag for an individual under the newly announced United States Gold Card program. Let's take a look at what dropping $1 million actually gets you.
So the U.S. Gold Card is essentially replacing the older EB-5 visa program. At $1 million for an individual, or actually it's $2 million if a corporation is sponsoring a foreign-born employee, it completely removes this old, heavy bureaucratic requirement where you had to prove you created at least 10 jobs. Instead, it just offers a fast track to legal residency. It places approved applicants straight into the priority EB-1 or EB-2 classifications, which are usually reserved for exceptional skills or merit. Basically, it's a paid, direct path to potential U.S. citizenship.
Now, while the U.S. is taking this high-fee, direct purchase route, the United Arab Emirates is taking a completely different approach with its golden visa. The UAE really wants to remove friction to attract foreign talent. Their golden visa provides a 5 to 10-year renewable residence that entirely removes the need for a local sponsor. It even lets you stay outside the UAE for more than the usual 6 months without losing your status, and you can freely sponsor your spouse and kids. It's two totally different philosophies, right? One is an upfront premium toll, and the other is an offer of unparalleled flexibility. Moving right along to Section 2, Tech Gateways and Hurdles. The Skilled Worker Squeeze. Okay, so the employer-sponsored H-1B visa is heavily utilized globally, and Indian professionals actually form the largest group of beneficiaries worldwide. Historically, the administrative cost for this was around $1,500, but get this, under a new presidential proclamation, this fee is leaping to a staggering $100,000 annually. I mean, wow, this represents a massive, massive barrier for companies trying to sponsor foreign tech talent in the U.S. But as one door becomes incredibly expensive to open, another one swings wide. Europe has swooped in with a really strategic alternative. They recently launched the European Legal Gateway Office, or LGO, in India. Implemented by the International Center for Migration Policy Development, this is designed as a one-stop hub. Its whole goal is to guide students, researchers, and professionals, starting specifically with the information and communication technology sector, on legal pathways across European Union member states. It's a direct counterplay to scoop up the tech talent that might now find the U.S. just way out of reach. And highly targeted solutions are popping up in Asia, too. For instance, India has introduced the EB-4 visa specifically for Chinese nationals. Now, this isn't for general tourism. It's highly focused on business folks who need to do equipment installation, quality checks, or IT and ERP ramp-ups. It's processed entirely online in about 45 to 50 days and permits a stay of up to 6 months. It's a precise, people-centric gateway designed to smooth out supply chain and tech investments. It really shows how visas are being used as surgical economic tools right now.
Section 3, controlling the borders. Dismantling human smuggling.
So this is Operation Hillmore. It's a migration pilot agreement between the United Kingdom and France, often referred to as the one-in, one-out scheme. The ultimate goal here is to completely dismantle human smuggling networks. Here's how it works. When migrants attempt to cross the English Channel in small boats, the UK and France use a direct exchange mechanism to immediately deport them back. It is a very strict deterrent designed specifically to break the business model of smugglers. And to ground this policy in a real-world event from our sources, here is a pretty surprising fact. The very first individual to actually be deported from the UK under this specific scheme was an Indian national. It really highlights how rapidly and indiscriminately these new direct exchange enforcement mechanisms are being applied on the ground.
All right, Section 4, ending historical labor systems, scrapping decades-old rules. Right in the heart of the Gulf Cooperation Council region, Saudi Arabia has just announced a monumental labor reform. They have officially scrapped the decades-old kafala system. And to really grasp why this is such a huge deal, we need to understand exactly what they just abolished.
So the kafala system was a traditional sponsorship framework. It legally required foreign workers to be inextricably tied to a specific employer or sponsor. This meant a worker's legal status, and often their ability to change jobs or honestly even leave the country, was entirely in the hands of their sponsor. So by ending this system, Saudi Arabia is giving foreign workers a newfound level of freedom and mobility that fundamentally shifts the labor dynamics of the entire region. Absolutely crucial stuff.
And our final section, number 5, Diaspora Roots and Residency, Reconnecting with the Past. I want to pose a question directly to you. Who are the Gurmatiyas? It's a term you might have heard lately in international relations, but the history behind it is absolutely fascinating. The answer actually lies in linguistics and history. The word Girmit is a historical mispronunciation of the English word agreement. It refers to the legal contract under which Indian laborers left India in the mid to late 19th century to work in British colonies. These laborers who had a strong Bhojpuri-speaking heritage were taken to places like Mauritius, Fiji, and Trinidad and Tobago. Generations later, their descendants have established really deep roots all over the world. And this historical context brings us perfectly to the modern Overseas Citizen of India, or OCI card. India is actively trying to connect with this global diaspora, including the descendants of the Gurmatiyas in places like Trinidad and Tobago. Now, while it isn't full citizenship, it provides incredible privileges. We're talking permanent residency, lifelong multiple entry visas, and the ability to own commercial and residential property. Parity with non-resident Indians in most economic and educational matters is pretty much standard now. Recently, the government even launched a simplified online portal to make claiming these rights way easier. It's just a really powerful way of legally reconnecting a global diaspora back to its origin. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. We've seen million-dollar fast tracks, $100,000 visa hikes, strict deportation schemes, and massive historical labor reforms. As global borders clearly become easier to buy but so much harder to cross, how will the world balance this intense race for elite talent with the deep historical roots and rights of its working diasporas? It's like a giant puzzle, and understanding the policies we discussed today is the very first step to seeing exactly where the world is heading. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today, and I look forward to diving into another fascinating topic with you next time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this Explainer. We're jumping right in today because we're unpacking a topic that literally impacts every single person on the planet. I want you to imagine global security as this massive, incredibly intricate Jenga tower. For decades, the foundational blocks keeping that whole structure from toppling over have been a series of complex international treaties and defense agreements. But recently, well, some of those crucial pieces are being pulled out. So today, we're going to explore the shifting architecture of global disarmament and defense to figure out exactly how our world is changing.
It's a pretty heavy question, right? What actually happens when the guardrails of global security, the specific, written rules designed to prevent catastrophic conflict, just start to disappear? If you pull enough pieces from that Jenga tower, the whole thing becomes dangerously wobbly. We're currently watching major powers rethink their commitments to historical agreements in real time. And as those old safety nets fray, totally new types of alliances and military operations are rushing in to fill the void.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the Explainer. 1. Fraying nuclear security guardrails. 2. Banning devastating global weapons. 3. Global forums and dialogues. 4. Rising strategic bilateral alliances. And finally, 5. Modern global military operations.
Section 1. Fraying nuclear security guardrails. Historically speaking, massive, carefully negotiated agreements were pretty much the only things keeping nuclear-armed superpowers in check. They gave us transparency, they set hard limits, and they quite literally prevented the Cold War from turning hot. We can trace these vital safety nets right through time. You've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty entering into force back in 1970. Then, in 1987, the INF Treaty was signed. Fast forward to 2000 for the PMDA, and then 2011 when New START entered into force. These aren't just arbitrary dates. These are the actual foundational pillars of our global security Jenga tower, painstakingly built over decades.
The real bedrock of all this architecture is the NPT.
It established the core rules of the road for the entire world based on 3 interconnected pillars. First up is non-proliferation, meaning nuclear weapon states agree not to hand over weapons, and non-nuclear states agree not to try and get them. Second is disarmament, which is a commitment to eventually negotiate the reduction of nuclear arsenals. And third is the peaceful use of nuclear energy, which allows access to nuclear tech but under really strict safeguards. It's this incredibly delicate balancing act, but it is somehow held up for over 50 years. Let's fast forward a bit to the new START treaty between the US and Russia. This agreement caps the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads at exactly 1,550 for each side. It also limits deployed ground or submarine-launched missiles and bombers. Now, 1,550 is a massive number, absolutely. But without this hard cap and the short-notice inspections that the treaty allows to actually verify compliance, we could be looking at a completely unchecked arms race. With this treaty nearing its expiration date, you can literally feel the anxiety in the international defense community right now.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the number 34. That is the exact tonnage of weapons-grade plutonium that the United States and Russia each agreed to dispose of under the PMDA, or the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement. To put that into perspective, 34 tons is enough material to create around 17,000 nuclear warheads. 17,000! The whole point of the deal was to convert this incredibly dangerous material into safer forms like fuel for producing electricity. However, Russia's parliament has now officially approved their withdrawal from this agreement.
And the dismantling just kind of continues from there. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty, was absolutely crucial to Euro-Atlantic security for decades. It literally wiped out an entire category of nuclear weapons, specifically those mid-range missiles that basically held Europe hostage throughout the 1980s. But Russia has officially withdrawn from the INF Treaty too. So the takeaway here is that these vital agreements, the ones that took decades of grueling work to build, are unraveling. They're pulling blocks straight out of the tower and removing the exact regulations we rely on to keep escalation in check.
Section 2. Banning devastating global weapons.
Now, when we shift our focus away from nuclear arms and look at the conventions governing devastating non-nuclear warfare, we actually do see a few bright spots. For instance, 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the Biological Weapons Convention, or BWC. When it entered into force in 1975, it was literally the first global agreement of its kind. It bans an entire class of weapons of mass destruction outright. It completely prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxin weapons for its 189 member states, which includes India. It truly stands as a monumental achievement for global security.
That said, other conventions face way steeper challenges. Take cluster munitions, for example. By definition, these are weapons dropped from aircraft or fired from artillery that explode midair, scattering smaller explosive submunitions over a massive area. The really tragic reality here is that these smaller explosives often fail to detonate on impact, so they just sit there, remaining highly dangerous and causing severe civilian harm long after a conflict has officially ended.
Because of that extreme humanitarian threat, the Convention on Cluster Munitions was signed in 2008. Over 100 countries stepped up and signed or ratified this treaty to prohibit their use, stockpiling, and production entirely. However, and this is a big however, major military powers, including the US, India, Russia, and China, have notably chosen to remain outside of it. This really highlights this deep, ongoing tension between humanitarian concerns on one side and the strategic utility that major powers believe these specific weapons give them on the other.
And this brilliantly illustrates the macro landscape we've just been talking about. The NPT is still active, but New START is expiring, Russia's withdrawing from the PMDA, and they've already withdrawn from the INF. That Jenga tower of global security we mentioned at the very beginning? Actually, scratch that. It's feeling more like a Jenga tower of doom at this point. You can literally see the pieces falling out right in front of us.
Section 3. Global Forums and Dialogues. So what happens when legally binding treaties start to fail or expire? How do global leaders actually adapt? Well, this is where platforms like the Munich Security Conference become absolutely vital. It's an annual event that brings together over 450 senior decision makers. We're talking heads of state, ministers, and top-tier military experts from all over the world. When the written rules of the international order are in total flux, face-to-face dialogues in forums like Munich become the essential space for exchanging ideas, managing immediate tensions, and just trying to develop new solutions to these crazy, unpredictable security shifts.
Section 4. Rising strategic bilateral alliances.
As global treaties waver, nations aren't just sitting around talking. They are taking action at a micro level, forging new, highly targeted partnerships to secure their own defense needs. A perfect case study for this is India's balanced, multi-aligned diplomacy. On the one hand, India's RELOS agreement with Russia creates a very practical framework for logistical support during joint missions. But simultaneously, they're engaging in highly advanced sonobuoy cooperation with the United States. Sonobuoys, by the way, are expendable devices used to detect submarines. By co-producing these with the US, India massively enhances its undersea domain awareness. It's honestly a masterclass in balancing relationships to boost your own national capability.
Let's demystify that RLOS agreement with Russia for a second, because the technical details really matter here. While reciprocal exchange of logistics support sounds massive and sweeping, it's actually heavily regulated. It essentially covers the basics: fuel, supplies, medical aid. More importantly, it has super strict limits. It caps involvement at 3,000 personnel, 5 ships, and 10 aircraft at a single time. It is largely a technical agreement, and it specifically does not grant automatic base access. These bilateral deals are carefully designed to build capability without unnecessarily escalating global tensions.
Section 5. Modern Global Military Operations.
Okay, let's move to and see how this builds from diplomatic paper to actual boots, ships, and planes on the ground. Modern military deployments essentially have a dual nature to them, and it's perfectly captured by 2 recent, very distinct operations. First, you have kinetic force projection against non-state threats. Think of the US-led Operation Hawkeye Strike in Syria, which aggressively targets ISIS funding networks and sleeper cells. But contrast that with Operation Sagar Bandhu. In this one, India deployed its massive flagship aircraft carrier, the INS Vikrant, to Sri Lanka. Not for combat, but to deliver absolutely vital humanitarian assistance and rapid disaster relief following Cyclone Ditwa.
Now that second type of operation, it is incredibly strategic. Operation Sagar Bandhu isn't just about charity. It's a powerful demonstration of soft power and vast logistical capability. By rapidly deploying major naval assets for disaster relief, India essentially cements its status as a preferred security partner in the Indian Ocean region. In today's complex defense architecture, the ability to save lives quickly is just as crucial to national security and to your regional influence as the ability to project lethal force.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. We've seen the foundational Jenga blocks of massive nuclear treaties like the INF and PMDA being pulled right out of the tower. We've seen nations adapt through these new targeted bilateral deals and highly dynamic military operations. But as these old treaties fade out and new alliances rise up to take their place, are we entering a safer world or a vastly more unpredictable one? It's a complex, constantly shifting landscape, and honestly, understanding these pieces is just the first step to navigating it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the world around you.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're decoding the fragile, ever-evolving patchwork of international diplomacy that literally shapes the world we live in. You know, if you just glance at the news, it can honestly feel like the globe is fracturing apart. But behind closed doors, there's this tremendous amount of diplomatic engineering happening constantly to hold things together. Or, in some cases, to completely rewrite the rules of engagement. We're going to dive into the very architecture of modern treaties, from high-stakes territorial truces all the way to those overlooked but super important civil pacts like the Hague Service Convention or US-India Cultural Property Agreements.
Okay, so we've got 5 main stops on our map today. First, the Middle East paradigm shift. Second, Palestine and Gaza proposals. Third, forging peace in Africa. Fourth, the Caucasus Truce. And lastly, South Asian treaties under threat. Let's get right into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the Middle East paradigm shift.
So, we begin our look at global peace right here, in a region that's witnessing just a profound transformation in how peace is negotiated. For decades, the diplomatic playbook in the Middle East was pretty much set in stone. Pre-2020, most Arab nations flat out refused to recognize Israel until the Palestinian issue was officially resolved. But then, in 2020, the UAE became the first Gulf country to break that mold, normalizing relations under the US-brokered Abraham Accords. And that momentum, it hasn't stopped. We even see Kazakhstan formally joining the Accords in 2026.
The absolute game changer here is that these accords totally bypass those traditional prerequisites. It shifted the geopolitical baseline entirely. Instead of waiting for a massive, comprehensive peace resolution to establish ties, these nations just went ahead and established open economic and political relations first. It's a totally fascinating pivot in modern statecraft.
All right, moving on to Section 2, Palestine and Gaza proposals.
Now, as these regional paradigms shift, we're seeing massive new proposals to address the core conflicts. Take the proposed Board of Peace for Gaza. It's an international body chaired by Donald Trump, created to oversee the October 2025 ceasefire. But here's the thing, its mandate goes way beyond just watching over a truce. It actually directly oversees the National Committee for Administration of Gaza, which basically acts as the local governing committee for civil administration and public services.
And to fund this massive transition, a cool $10 billion commitment was announced for Gaza right alongside the board's launch. $10 billion! This really highlights a massive recurring theme we're seeing in modern peacebuilding. Political agreements are increasingly being backed by absolutely massive financial incentives because, physically and economically rebuilding an area is what actually sustains peace on the ground.
Meanwhile, taking a look at the UN General Assembly, you can see this overwhelming international push for a sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. This resolution, introduced by France and endorsing the New York Declaration, calls for a two-state solution, an end to the war, and a halt to settlement expansion. And just look at the numbers. 142 nations in favor, including India, which is 10 against, which included the US and Israel. That sheer volume of support shows a really strong collective international stance happening right alongside those bilateral negotiations.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, Forging Peace in Africa. Leaving the Middle East, we're seeing similar diplomatic tools applied to end some really enduring conflicts in the African Great Lakes region. Look at the recently signed Washington Accords for Peace and Prosperity between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda. This isn't just about putting down weapons. Step 3 is the real kicker here, implementing the Regional Economic Integration Framework, or REEF.
Now, why does this matter to us? Because it proves how modern treaties are literally intertwining security directly with economic incentives to maintain stability. Peace isn't just not fighting anymore, it's actively being engineered as a platform for shared economic prosperity. Think about it. If both the DRC and Rwanda are mutually invested in regional growth, the cost of going back to war becomes economically devastating for everybody.
Okay, on to Section 4, the Caucasus Truce.
Moving over to Eurasia, we've got a decades-old border conflict that finally hit the negotiation table. Historically, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a region located inside Azerbaijani's international borders, but historically had an Armenian majority, has been an absolute flashpoint. This crazy complex demographic and geographic reality led to devastating wars when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, then again with intense fighting in 2020, and once more in 2023 when Azerbaijan took full control of the region.
But check this out. After literally decades of bitter, deeply entrenched fighting over ethnic ties and territorial control, these two nations shifted from historical warfare to a brand new peace. By signing the historic Armenia-Azerbaijan peace treaty brokered by the US at the White House, they basically created a completely new geopolitical reality for the South Caucasus.
And a super vital outcome of that deal is the Tripped Corridor. It links Azerbaijan to its exclave of Nakhchivan right through Armenian territory. But here is the wildest part. The United States gained exclusive rights to develop and manage this critical new trade route, and they didn't have to deploy a single soldier to do it. It's just a textbook, fascinating exercise of soft power and infrastructure diplomacy.
Finally, Section 5, South Asian Treaties Under Threat. So, while we've been seeing new agreements popping up, down in South Asia, historic foundational pacts are actually crumbling as we speak. Take the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty. This was a World Bank brokered agreement that literally determines the flow of life-sustaining water. Under this pact, India controls the eastern rivers, getting 20% of the system, while Pakistan controls the western rivers, which grants them 80%. For over 60 years, this treaty was hailed as one of the most successful water-sharing agreements on Earth, surviving multiple wars.
But, as we're seeing, sudden geopolitical shocks can change everything in an instant. Following the Pahalgam terror strike, India's Cabinet Committee on Security suspended the treaty. Boom, just like that. It's a really stark reminder that even the most deeply entrenched resource agreements are ultimately at the mercy of the overarching security environment.
And the scale of these fracturing agreements is just massive. Look at another foundational pact, the 1972 Simla Agreement. Signed after the 1971 war, this thing set the boundaries for peace for half a century. It mandated bilateral conflict resolution, redesignated the line of control, and involved huge concessions, like India returning over 13,000 square kilometers of territory and releasing over 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. I mean, this was the absolute bedrock of India-Pakistan relations.
However, in response to India's recent actions, Pakistan has now suspended the 1972 Simla Agreement as a retaliatory move. We're impartially seeing how modern retaliations have fractured this cornerstone treaty, proving once again that peace is never permanently sealed. When the foundational texts that govern borders and relations are suspended, the entire diplomatic architecture of a region gets thrown into total uncertainty.
So, I want to leave you with this thought to ponder. As we've seen today, from the shifting paradigms in the Middle East and the economic frameworks in Africa, to the sudden suspension of decades-old treaties in South Asia, or even everyday civil pacts like the U.S.-India Cultural Property Agreement and the Hague Service Convention, peace is absolutely not just a document signed in a room. It's an active, daily commitment. It's vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, and it relies heavily on continuous economic and diplomatic effort. So, what do you think is the strongest glue for modern peace? Shared economic prosperity or strict security guarantees? I hope this explainer helped you understand the real mechanics behind the headlines. Keep learning, stay curious, and thanks so much for joining us.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here with us today because, wow, we are unpacking something truly monumental. Right now, literally as we speak, behind closed doors and out across international waters, the world is basically writing a brand new global rulebook for the 21st century. It's a massive shift in how nations interact, and it's going to impact everything from that smartphone in your pocket to the very air you breathe.
So how exactly do you govern a world that is running out of resources and patience? Honestly, it's the ultimate question of our time. At first glance, things like international corporate taxation, deep-sea mining rights, and climate tariffs, they might seem like totally disconnected topics, right? Like a random grab bag. But as we'll explore today, they are actually interlocking chapters of our future. They're the literal mechanisms deciding who holds the wealth, who controls the tech, and, crucially, who pays for the health of our planet.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're covering 5 key areas: the new global rulebook, securing critical future resources, mining the deep ocean, climate tariffs explained, and finally, solar power and pandemic prep. Let's get started.
Section 1. The new global rulebook. Rewriting global wealth.
Now, before we get into the environment or resources, we have to talk about capital, because money talks, right? We are witnessing the first major shift in global governance regarding how multinational corporations are actually taxed across borders. And the magic number you need to remember here is 15%. This is the global corporate minimum tax rate. Led by the OECD, this was a massive, historic agreement reached by 137 countries back in 2021. You know how for decades, massive corporations have been able to just shift their profits into low-tax jurisdictions, those classic tax havens, to significantly dodge what they pay? Well, this 15% rate is designed to finally put an end to that global race to the bottom.
So, the crucial point is how this actually works in practice. It's not just a handshake deal. The system rests on 2 main pillars. Pillar 1 changes the rules so that taxes are paid based on where a company actually does its business and makes its money, rather than just where it magically parks its headquarters. And Pillar 2? That's the enforcement. If a company somehow manages to pay less than 15% in one country, other countries are allowed to swoop in and apply a top-up tax to bring the total right back up to that 15% floor. It creates a unified baseline. However, and this is a big however, the geopolitical landscape is always shifting. U.S. leadership recently signaled that this 2021 agreement basically has no effect in the United States. It's a real-world example of just how incredibly complex global financial diplomacy can be.
Moving on to Section 2, securing critical future resources, the tech and mineral rush.
So we're transitioning now from securing tax revenues to securing the actual physical and technological building blocks of our modern economy. Because, look, having the money is one thing, but if you don't have the physical materials to build the future, you are going to be left behind. Nations are taking a 2-pronged approach right now, and this brilliantly illustrates the strategy. On the physical side, we've got the Forge initiative. Created as a successor to the Mineral Security Partnership, Forge is a huge multilateral framework designed to de-risk the global supply chains of critical minerals. Basically, it's about securing the raw dirt. Then, on the digital side, we have Pacts. This U.S.-led initiative focuses on the technology built from those minerals. We're talking AI infrastructure and semiconductors. Together, they form a complete end-to-end strategy, from raw material all the way to advanced microchips.
And both of these alliances share a really clear primary goal: reducing our overdependence on just a few dominant suppliers to build trusted, secure ecosystems. You'll often hear this called the China Plus One shift, which is all about helping nations diversify their supply lines so all their eggs aren't in one basket. For a participating country like India, these global alliances integrate perfectly with their domestic goals, like their national critical minerals mission. How? By attracting big investments, safeguarding highly sensitive tech, and building a trusted environment completely away from monopolized markets. It's a real game changer.
All right, Section 3, Mining the Deep Ocean, the Final Frontier.
Now, that desperate global rush for critical minerals, it brings us directly to literally the most extreme environment on Earth, the deep sea floor. The treasure buried down there is known as polymetallic sulfides. Basically, these are deep ocean floor deposits found near hydrothermal vents. They form in this wild process where freezing cold seawater seeps into cracks in the seabed, interacts with boiling magma, and then shoots back out, depositing these incredibly concentrated mounds of minerals. We are talking high-grade copper, zinc, lead, gold, and silver. These are the exact crucial materials we need for renewable energy and green technologies.
But you can't just sail out on a boat and start mining. A massive 54% of the world's oceans fall entirely outside any single nation's borders. This vast open region is known simply as the area, and it's an autonomous zone regulated by the International Seabed Authority, or ISA for short, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The ISA's mandate is pretty heavy. They have to manage all these resources as the common heritage of humankind, so they're constantly balancing the need for mineral exploration with the absolutely vital need to protect the marine environment.
And to see just how fiercely competitive this is getting, you just have to look at India's recent diplomatic moves. India just signed a major contract with the ISA for the exclusive exploration of polymetallic sulfides in the Carlsberg Ridge in the Indian Ocean. This actually makes India the very first country globally to hold 2 of these ISA contracts, which gives them the largest allocated exploration area in the world. Seriously, it's an unprecedented allocation of rights, and it is aimed squarely at securing resource autonomy for their high-tech development.
Let's move on to Section 4, Climate Tariffs Explained, the Green Toll Booth. Now that we've looked at how materials are gathered, let's look at how they're traded. The EU is introducing what's often called the Green Toll Booth. Officially, it's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. It's essentially a green tariff, and it becomes fully effective in 2026. Basically, if you want to sell carbon-intensive goods, things like steel, aluminum, cement, or fertilizers, to the EU, you are now going to be charged a duty based on exactly how much carbon was emitted during their production back in your home country.
Let's move to and see how this builds in practice. It's essentially a 3-step process. Step 1, the carbon footprint of the entire production process is meticulously calculated. Step 2, those goods hit the European border. And Step 3, the EU importer has to actually purchase carbon certificates to cover those emissions. And the price tag? It isn't just arbitrary. It's tied directly to the EU's own internal carbon price, which is currently hovering around a really hefty 80 euros per ton of CO2.
As you might guess, this policy is currently causing some major geopolitical friction. From the EU's perspective, CBAM is absolutely essential to prevent what they call carbon leakage. That's when companies just up and move their production to countries with weaker environmental laws just so they can pollute cheaply. The EU argues this levels the playing field. But if you look at it from the perspective of developing nations like India and China, this is seen as a unilateral, totally unfair trade barrier. They argue it punishes developing economies and actually violates international climate agreements by forcing EU standards onto the rest of the world. So you can see it is a fundamental clash of economic and environmental priorities.
Which brings us to Section 5, Solar Power and Pandemic Prep, Protecting the Planet and People.
Amidst all this fierce competition over taxes, minerals, and trade, there are also some really unified global efforts fighting for human and planetary survival. First up is the International Solar Alliance, which was launched by India and France back at the COP21 Paris Agreement. This alliance has spread like wildfire and grown to over 100 member and signatory nations. Their primary mission? To massively unlock global solar investments by 2030, which will drastically reduce the cost of solar technology and financing. They work hand in hand with development banks to deploy these solutions where they're needed most, specifically in developing nations and small island developing states. In fact, Mauritius just recently became the 4th country globally and the very first in Africa to sign a country partnership framework with the ISA to really accelerate their clean energy access.
And of course, alongside the health of the planet, we have to look out for the health of its people. In May 2025, the World Health Assembly formally adopted the WHO Pandemic Agreement. Built directly upon the painful, super disruptive lessons we all learned during COVID-19, This is actually the world's first consensus on a legally binding framework designed to improve global pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when you look at these initiatives side by side, the sheer scale of cooperation is just unprecedented. We're looking at massive global coordination happening simultaneously. On one track, you have over 100 nations coordinating to physically alter how the entire world generates its power to achieve carbon neutrality. And then on the other track, you have a global consensus establishing legally binding rules to prevent the next great health crisis. It really shows that when the stakes are existential, when our backs are against the wall, multilateralism can still step up and produce these massive, sweeping frameworks.
Which brings us to our final thought. As you'll see, the rules of the game are changing incredibly fast. From enforcing a global floor on corporate taxes to the high-stakes race for those deep-sea minerals that will power our AI, right through to the green tariffs that are about to completely redefine global trade, it's like a giant puzzle. Everything is interconnected. The decisions being made right now are literally setting the geopolitical reality for decades to come. So the ultimate question remains, as this global rulebook is rewritten, who will emerge as the author of our future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.
Welcome, everyone, to a brand new explainer. Okay, today we're looking at something absolutely fascinating: the rapidly shifting dynamics of international relationships and alliances. You know, the world map as we know it, it isn't just about geography anymore. It's about networks, economic partnerships, and strategic alignments that are quite literally rewriting the rules of global power. So get ready, because we're going to unpack the architecture of a new world order right before your eyes.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's the ultimate question on pretty much every geopolitical analyst's mind right now, right? How exactly is the balance of global power shifting today? Well, to find the answer, we can't just look at one country or even one continent. We really have to take a journey. We're going to travel from the macro-level world of global finance and debt restructuring all the way over to regional realignments in Europe, and finally, we'll look at the incredible rising influence of India across multiple international forums.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, global finance and debt. Second, Europe's strategic economic shifts. And third, India takes the lead.
Section 1. Global Finance and Debt. Moving the money. Let's get into it.
You might notice Colombia and Uzbekistan showing up as prospective members here. They've actually just been approved by the Board of Governors to join the New Development Bank, or the NDB. Now, if you recall, the NDB was established by the BRICS nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, back in 2015. Its whole purpose really is to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development, specifically targeting emerging markets and developing countries. Adding nations like Colombia and Uzbekistan, that shows a really deliberate expansion of this alternative financial architecture. It's a real game changer.
But hey, it's not just about funding flashy new projects, right? It's also about managing old debts. And that brings us to the Sevilla Forum on Debt. Announced during the 16th United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, this is a Spanish-led initiative designed to tackle, well, severe global debt challenges. Instead of those closed-door, kind of secretive negotiations we're used to seeing, the Sevilla Forum aims to create an inclusive, open space for dialogue. Basically, it brings borrowers, creditors, and policymakers all to the exact same table to advance fair and responsible borrowing and lending practices. This is an absolutely crucial step towards stabilizing economies that are quite frankly buckling under structural deficiencies right now.
Moving on to Section 2, Europe's Strategic Economic Shifts, Rebalancing the Continent.
So the crucial point is the number 21. Recently, Bulgaria officially set the stage to become the 21st country to adopt the euro as its currency. And what's truly remarkable here is the timeline. Bulgaria joined the European Union way back in 2007, but they won't officially adopt the euro until 2026. I mean, think about that. That is a nearly 20-year waiting period.
So you might be wondering, why on earth did it take nearly 2 decades? Well, it turns out joining the Eurozone isn't just an automatic perk of being in the EU. To actually get there, Bulgaria had to hit some incredibly strict convergence criteria. We're talking integrating into the common market, radically adjusting their national laws and monetary policies, and fully complying with foundational EU treaties. The whole shebang. This strict alignment is basically there to ensure that any new member doesn't come in and disrupt the complex, unified economic and monetary union that was originally established by the 1992 Maastricht Treaty.
Now, beyond just currency, Europe is also physically redrawing its map. Enter the Three Seas Initiative, or 3SI, which actually just marked its decade-long anniversary since its conceptual inception back in 2015. Honestly, this is essential vocabulary for understanding Europe today. It's a strategic forum of 13 EU countries located between three major bodies of water, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Seas. And their main goal? To massively expand cross-border energy, transportation, and digital infrastructure.
But here is the so what factor, right? Like, why does 3SI actually matter to us? Well, historically, Europe's infrastructure was heavily focused on an east-west axis. The Three Seas Initiative is explicitly designed to address that historical imbalance by radically boosting north-south connectivity in Central and Eastern Europe. And by doing so, it's not just, building roads or laying down cables, it's strengthening regional economic growth, securing energy independence, and massively enhancing the region's overall role within the EU and NATO.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 3. India takes the lead, a geopolitical footprint.
India is rapidly accumulating influential leadership positions pretty much across the board right now. Economically, they recently took over as chair of the Asian Productivity Organization, which is a 21-member intergovernmental body promoting productivity across the Asia-Pacific. Then, up in the skies, they were just elected to the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, Council for the 2025-2028 term, specifically to champion the No Country Left Behind initiative. And on the diplomatic front, India just led a major parliamentary delegation to the 150th Assembly of the Inter-Parliamentary Union in Tashkent, really advancing global parliamentary diplomacy.
But honestly, perhaps India's most crucial strategic leadership role right now is right in its own backyard, the Indian Ocean. Before we look at the specific organization involved here, we really need to understand the sheer scale of this region. The Indian Ocean is home to nearly 2.7 billion people. It's a critical global trade artery, carrying half of all global container traffic and a staggering 2/3 of all oil shipments. The geopolitical weight of this region simply cannot be overstated.
And this brilliantly illustrates why it matters that India has now officially assumed the chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, or IOAR. Basically, this means managing 8 massive priority areas for 23 different member states. We're talking everything from maritime safety and security all the way over to the blue economy and women's economic empowerment. India is now tasked with leading and coordinating all these pillars. It's a massive diplomatic and economic responsibility, and it places India directly at the center of global maritime security and trade facilitation.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, we've seen developing economies carving out new spaces in global finance, with the expansion of the NDB and the creation of the Seville Forum. We've watched Europe aggressively tighten its economic integration and essentially redraw its infrastructure maps. And of course, we've witnessed India stepping into the driver's seat across vital aviation, productivity, and massive maritime coalitions. Now, these might seem like totally disconnected threads at first glance, but they are absolutely interlocking to build a completely new world order. I'm going to leave you with this question to ponder. How will these shifting alliances and new financial forums reshape global power dynamics over the next decade? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the architecture of our changing world.
Welcome back to The Explainer, folks. Today, we are looking at a world that is literally in absolute flux. We're living through this fascinating hyper-connected era where the traditional rules of global relations are pretty much being redrawn right in front of us. We are talking about massive thematic tides of global change. This covers everything from the really immediate, hard power dynamics of kinetic conflicts all the way over to borderless global climate initiatives. It's this incredibly complex web, shifting alliances, sudden pauses and decades-old violence, and literally unprecedented financial mobilizations. So our goal today is to cut through the noise and clearly map out these moving pieces for you, using the hard data directly from our sources, so you can see exactly how the ground is shifting beneath our feet.
So here's a quick look at what we're getting into today. 1. Front lines and historic ceasefires. 2. Treaties, joining and leaving. 3. Trillions for climate finance. And finally 4. Resuming the sacred yatra. Let's just jump right in.
All right, kicking things off with Part 1. Frontlines and historic ceasefires.
We're starting over at the Druzhba oil pipeline. Now, get this, Druzhba actually translates to friendship in Russian, which is, pretty ironic given what's happening right now. This thing is massive. It's an incredible 5,500 kilometers long, stretching through Belarus and Ukraine, and eventually splitting off to supply countries like Poland, Germany, Slovakia, and Hungary. Historically, it's been an absolutely critical artery for pumping Russian and Kazakh oil straight into Europe. But recently, Ukrainian forces actually struck the Unesha pumping station, which is a supercritical hub right in Russia's Bryansk region. So this isn't just some localized tactical move. It's a direct strike at an enormous energy lifeline. And it really just highlights how energy infrastructure is still a primary top-tier target in modern conflicts.
Now from active kinetic strikes to a sudden dead stop. 40. That number is heavy, because we're talking about 4 decades of violence. Just recently, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, declared an immediate ceasefire. This is a truly monumental step. It's halting a 40-year armed insurgency against the Turkish state. But to really grasp why this pause is such a massive deal, we need to unpack the human history behind that number.
So let's talk about who is actually at the heart of this. The Kurds are an Indo-European ethnic group, indigenous to the mountainous region of West Asia that's traditionally known as Kurdistan. But here's the catch. They don't have a recognized sovereign state of their own. Instead, they're spread out across several different Middle Eastern borders. Just to give you an idea of the scale here, imagine 15 to 20 million Kurds living in Turkey, another 8 to 12 million in Iran, roughly 7 million in Iraq, and about 2 million in Syria. It's a huge, distinct demographic woven across multiple national lines.
And this brings us right to the root of the historical friction. You see, after World War I, the Kurdish people were actually promised a nation, but that promise was entirely broken. They were never granted one. And that historic broken promise led to this profound sense of disenfranchisement, which sparked rebellions and resulted in severe state suppression of the Kurdish language and culture. That suppression was the direct catalyst for the PKK launching their armed insurgency back in the early 1980s, originally to fight for an independent Kurdish state. So understanding that deep-rooted history of broken promises is absolutely essential to understanding why this current ceasefire is such a historic milestone.
Moving right along to our second section, treaties. Who's joining and who's leaving?
Take Iran, for instance. They've been completely isolated on the FATF blacklist for a while now because of anti-money laundering and terror financing concerns. But they are currently making a major strategic play to escape that economic isolation. They just ratified a law to join the UN's International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, commonly called the CFT. By adopting this UN convention, which criminalizes terror financing and actually requires international cooperation, Iran is clearly trying to align itself with global financial norms. They're basically setting the stage, hoping for a reevaluation of their FATF blacklist status down the line.
But on the flip side, we're seeing established alliances stepping away from long-standing international norms. NATO members like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are actually planning to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention. That's the treaty that bans anti-personnel landmines. And they're doing this specifically to secure their borders against military threats from Russia. So it's this really chaotic diplomatic environment. While Eastern Europe is abandoning certain defense treaties, we're seeing completely new alignments pop up elsewhere in global trade, like the UN Convention on Negotiable Cargo Documents, aiming to streamline global shipping, or India recently stepping up to chair the Kimberley process to regulate the global flow of conflict diamonds. The international rulebook is literally being rewritten in real time.
Okay, pivoting to Section 3, Trillions for Climate Finance.
To really wrap your head around the scale of global climate finance, you have to look at the massive contrast here. On one side, you have a targeted local initiative, the SOF Impact Bond, at $200 million. But then on the other side, you have the global requirement, the Baku to Belém target, sitting at a staggering $1.3 trillion. Both are absolutely crucial. But looking at them side by side really helps us grasp the vast gap between funding a specific, immediate need and the sheer colossal financial mobilization required to actually tackle global climate action.
So let's zoom in on that $200 million piece. SOFF stands for the Systematic Observations Financing Facility. It's a specialized UN fund set up by the World Meteorological Organization, the UNDP, and the UNEP. They just launched this impact bond with a very specific, totally vital goal: to strengthen global weather and climate observations. It focuses heavily on the world's least developed nations and small island developing states, because right now, these are the countries with severe gaps in their ability to observe and predict extreme weather. So by funding this data collection, SOF is effectively building a worldwide public good. They're providing the essential data we all need to prepare for incoming climate disasters.
And then we zoom way out to the macro level, the Baku to Belém roadmap. Set up by the COP29 and COP30 presidencies, this roadmap aims to mobilize at least $1.3 trillion by the year 2035. This money is specifically targeted at developing countries to help them hit their climate targets. But what's really interesting here is how this finance is supposed to be structured.
India has actually been calling on BRICS nations to really unite behind this roadmap. And the reason is that it aims to provide support through grants, concessional finance, and non-debt instruments. The whole idea is to fund these massive green transitions without just trapping developing nations in an insurmountable cycle of debt.
Bringing us to our final section, resuming the sacred yatra.
The major news here is absolutely massive for thousands of people. The Kailash Mansarovar Yatra is finally resuming. This deeply sacred, ancient international pilgrimage has been on an agonizing 5-year pause. And this wasn't just because of the global health crisis during the pandemic. It was severely compounded by the really tense military standoff and geopolitical friction between India and China along their shared border. So getting this journey back on track is a huge diplomatic and logistical win.
Just mapping out this route shows you what a massive logistical puzzle this is. The journey, which is organized by India's Ministry of External Affairs, literally traverses 3 separate countries. You start in India, cross through Nepal, and then ascend way up into the high altitudes of Tibet in China. The MEA normally runs this through 2 incredibly high-altitude passes, the Lipulekh Pass in Uttarakhand and the Nathu La Pass in Sikkim. Think about the level of coordination required between nations that, as we just mentioned, have had some very serious recent border friction. It's really quite an undertaking.
So why do thousands of people put themselves through this intense, rigorous border crossing? Well, it's all about Mount Kailash. Rising to over 6,600 meters in the remote southwestern Himalayas of Tibet, this perfectly symmetrical black rock peak is considered profoundly sacred by 4 major world religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the Bon religion. For Hindus, it is literally the abode of Lord Shiva and the cosmic center of the world. It's also the geographical source of 4 major Asian rivers. And here's an amazing fact. Out of deep, deep reverence for its sacred status, the peak of Mount Kailash has actually never been climbed by modern mountaineers. Its spiritual pull completely transcends any modern geopolitical borders.
The ultimate climax of the whole pilgrimage is the circumambulation of the mountain. And guys, this is not a casual walk. It is a grueling 52-kilometer trek through some of the most rugged, high-altitude, dry landscapes on Earth, and it's typically done over 3 exhausting days. Hindus and Buddhists walk the route clockwise, while Jains and Bon followers walk it counterclockwise. But despite the extreme physical hardship, devotees undertake this journey with the profound belief that completing it will wash away their sins and bring immense good fortune. It is just an incredible testament to human endurance driven by unshakable faith.
Which brings us to the big picture, our final thought for the day. We've talked about missiles hitting energy pipelines, and 40-year insurgencies suddenly pausing. We've watched nations scrambling to join treaties for their economic survival, while others literally walk away from humanitarian treaties just to defend their borders. We've looked at the trillions of dollars needed to fight a borderless climate crisis and the return of a sacred journey that cuts right through some of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. It really leaves us with a critical question to think about. How will these shifting treaties, these evolving physical conflicts, and this desperate need for climate cooperation ultimately redefine what a global border even means in the coming decade? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.